Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are looking at something completely wild. We're going to dive into how a very real, horrific public health crisis actually birthed the legendary monster we know today as the vampire. So get ready, because the truth is actually much stranger and definitely much messier than fiction. You know, it's a really fascinating question to think about. How exactly did the stench of 18th century churches and a public health crisis accidentally give birth to the modern vampire? To investigate this historical medical mystery, we have to go all the way back to the 1720s. It was a time when science and superstition were colliding head-on, and the dead seemingly refused to stay buried. Picture this. It's 1725 in Serbia, and sheer terror has gripped the village of Kisiljevo. A widow there claimed that her recently deceased husband, Petar Blagojević, returned from the grave. He supposedly demanded his shoes, attempted to strangle her, and fatally attacked 9 other villagers. And the craziest part? The victims all reported the exact same horrifying detail, that Petar, and I quote, laid himself upon them and throttled them. Shortly after, every single one of those victims mysteriously died of a sudden illness. Well, the terrified village elders quickly diagnosed Petar with a chilling label. They called him a vampiri, which is an 18th century Serbian term translating to back from the dead. This horrifying situation spread quickly and soon caught the attention of an imperial health and safety official named Provisor Frombold, who was immediately dispatched to the village. So Frombold was originally just sent down there to stop a potential disease outbreak, right? But things took a totally dark turn. Upon officially exhuming Petar, Frombold found a corpse that appeared, in his words, completely fresh. And even more horrifying to this 18th century official, he noted fresh blood all around the corpse's mouth. Out of sheer panic, the terrified locals decided to enact a drastic, gruesome medieval cure. They exhumed the body, drove a sharpened stake right through Petar's torso, and planned to decapitate and burn the corpse. But here is where it gets really crazy. When the stake pierced his chest, Frombold officially reported that fresh blood actually gushed from the corpse's ears and mouth. To him, this was undeniable, absolute proof of the undead. That brings us to part 1, investigating the undead, the case of Vampire Zero. Because, yeah, this bizarre phenomenon wasn't just a one-off. The panic quickly spread, prompting even more official medical investigations. Fast forward to 1731, and an Austrian surgeon was investigating another massive outbreak surrounding a vampire zero named Arnold Paole. Paole allegedly infected local cattle during his post-mortem rampage, and when the villagers later slaughtered and ate that contaminated meat, it eventually led to a whopping 17 new human vampires. When Surgeon Johannes Flukinger dug into these 17 cases, he found corpses that supposedly groaned and bled when staked. But he was making a fatal scientific error here. He was confusing entirely natural biological decomposition anomalies, things like the natural purging of fluids and trapped gases escaping, with supernatural activity. Flukinger basically couldn't explain the lack of decay scientifically, so he just let his imperial bias take the wheel. He ruthlessly labeled the poor peasants and outsiders as vampires, having them all exhumed and staked. Meanwhile, wealthy Hungarians exhibiting the exact same biological decomposition traits were miraculously deemed uncorrupted and were quietly, safely reburied. So what was actually bringing the dead back to life? I mean, if it wasn't the supernatural, and if the medical science of the time was completely failing to understand basic decomposition, we really have to look elsewhere. We have to look at the massive, putrid crisis that was literally bursting out of the ground beneath their feet. Let's dive into part 2, the grave overcrowding crisis, a disaster waiting to unearth. You see, the true culprit here wasn't monsters at all. It was centuries of rapid urbanization that had completely overwhelmed European burial systems. Since the 11th century, cities had been surging, and to maximize their burial fees, churches stubbornly stuffed bodies into incredibly tight urban spaces. By the end of the 17th century, graveyards were totally full. Sextons resorted to just tossing the poor into mass pits wrapped in mere fabric shrouds or digging new graves dangerously shallow. We're talking often just 2 feet deep. And thanks to these incredibly shallow graves, the dead literally could not stay hidden. completely ordinary things, like a heavy rainstorm washing away some topsoil, a pack of hungry dogs wandering through, or just sloppy gravediggers doing a bad job, were more than enough to rip bodies from the earth and expose them to the horrified public.
And honestly, even when the bodies did stay hidden, the horrifying stench absolutely did not. In 1721, a London curate named Thomas Lewis published a pamphlet complaining about this. He warned that the mephitic stink of rotting flesh seeping up from these overstuffed tombs was quite literally causing dysentery and plague among the living.
So when these shallow buried bodies were exposed to the air, they often looked bloated and ruddy because of those trapped gases, rather than all withered away like you typically expect. Terrified folks, lacking any real scientific understanding of this, saw this lifelike appearance and fully believed the corpses had been out feeding on the blood of the living. Which leads us right into part 3, debunking the myth, science versus superstition. As the Age of Enlightenment really took hold, bureaucratic reports of these vampires sparked a massive, intense debate among scholars and clergy. They desperately wanted to move past medieval witch hunts, and we can actually track how this panic was finally killed, not by a wooden stake, mind you, but by logic, science, and civil engineering. The shift kicks off with Curate Lewis complaining about odors in 1721, moves through official scholarly debunking, and leads all the way to a massive societal overhaul of how we handled the dead by 1804. The real ideological turning point happened in 1746. That's when Vatican scholar Dom Augustin Calmet officially concluded that absolutely nobody was rising from the grave. He firmly classified vampires purely as creatures of imagination, officially closing the book on the supernatural debate once and for all. With the supernatural fears finally put to rest by the church, actual public health experts and urban planners could step in to fix the real problem. This led to a massive, pivotal moment in 1780, the official closure of Paris's Central Cemetery of the Innocents, which had been, up to that point, quite literally bursting at the seams with bodies. Those gruesome, overflowing urban graveyards were completely emptied out. They were replaced by sanitary, walled garden cemeteries built well outside the city limits. By burying the dead securely, out of sight and out of mind, the messy reality of decomposition was effectively hidden from the public eye. And that brings us to part 4, birth of the modern vampire, from ghoul to aristocrat.
Once the very real fear of rotting, disease-spreading corpses was solved by, basic civil engineering, the vampire was suddenly free to evolve. The monster completely shed its historical identity as a barely sentient, mud-caked ghoul. Because the dead were now safely tucked away in elegant necropolises, the vampire was reborn in 19th century romantic literature as a sophisticated supernatural aristocrat wandering those very same beautiful garden cemeteries.
It's truly fascinating when you think about it. A completely practical public health crisis, a failure of urban sanitation and burial logistics, accidentally birthed one of the most enduring legends in human history. It leaves us to wonder, if overflowing graves shaped the monsters of our past, what mundane realities are fueling today's greatest myths? Definitely something to think about next time you watch a horror movie. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.